Good morning, dear subscribers of React Facebook page. Today we have a traditional our Friday broadcast, but in a bit unusual form of a webinar. The topic of the webinar is Russia and the US, a new Cold War or the way to a new detente. And together with us is Ilya Kravchenko, expert of Russian Strategic Research Institute, yes?
Russian Institute for Strategic Studies.
Institute for Strategic Studies, I'm sorry, yes. Forgot the English name for it. And Richard Weiss from Hudson Institute. On this January, Pentagon released the summary of National Defense Strategy of the United States that builds up on Donald Trump's national security strategy. And the document gives considerable attention to deterring Russia and China and building up US military capabilities in order to efficiently counter Moscow. On the other hand, later in March, Vladimir Putin, in his address to the Federal Assembly, presented data regarding Russia's newest weapons, including the small-size, powerful nuclear energy system for missiles that can reach almost any place on Earth. So, given all that in events and discussions that followed, what do you think? These new steps, are they the steps towards the further escalation of and further misunderstanding between Russia and the US, which some people call new Cold War, or maybe this is part of negotiations towards the new agreement and maybe new detente? Let's start this time with Ilya, because it's the second round. We had the first round of this discussion in November. So, Ilya, please.
Thank you, Nikolai. Well, first of all, it's very interesting that this week we had a very fine date, I would say. A date that's very important for the history of US-Russian relations. We had 70 years of Marshall Plan that was actually signed by President Truman on April 4th. 70 years ago. So and it's interesting because 70 years ago and today we have some equivalence in regarding to Russian-US relations. In case we try to understand how this all functions, because there is no Marshall Plan anymore, but the way that the United States sometimes officially or unofficially stating that Europe is a sphere of interest of the United States of America, and Russia trying to say that, well, Europe is Europe, but let's not try to emphasize the division of Europe, because if we try to divide Europe more, if we try to use these divisions, it will lead to nothing but to the growth of some nationalistic movements and so on and so on. And we can see that actually it all happens this way, because now we have this opposition to all the globalization issues, as of this whole idea of westernization, because maybe like 20 years ago, countries that are now in a way oppose the globalization process and this global integration. 20 years ago, they were not. They couldn't even imagine that they would say this today. I mean, the countries that are well, if we mention Italy, for example, if even Austria. I mean, Austria in like 70 years ago. Well, let's not say like 60 years ago. Okay, 60 years ago, when it first appeared as an independent state, like really independent state, was trying to somehow mediate and to be in the middle of the two of the battle between these two giants, USSR and United States of America. And now Austria is saying, okay, you guys fight with each other. Well, not of course, in terms of real battle, but all this diplomatic stuff, we will not interfere in this, and perhaps even be a platform for sort of negotiations. And this, all these parallels, they are quite interesting from my point of view, because even though the Cold War ended, and I can't say that the Cold War that we are told that has now reappeared. Sometimes told from the expertise, sometimes from the television, sometimes even from state officials in different countries. That there's a Cold War that's now going on. I can't say that this is a Cold War that the countries are used to, because the rules are a bit different. There are no big ideology battles anymore, but the type that's been used to identify the current situation between our countries, and in general the terms that we try to identify for all those events that take place nowadays between the countries, regarding the diplomacy crisis between not only Russia and the United States, but between many countries, because not all, even the Western countries, appear to be on the side of the United States on some issues, and some Asian countries do not agree on. So this diplomacy crisis is all this crisis of deployment of new weapons, because 20 years ago the West, and if we say in general, and Russia were trying to formulate a new agenda for the nuclear weapons, for all sorts of weaponry, trying to reduce the numbers of missiles, trying not to impose new sanctions on each other, trying to negotiate more. But now all those negotiations, they somehow disappeared from the table, and even the platforms. I mentioned Austria, but there are not so many other countries that are eager to become platforms for negotiations, even to meet. People can't even meet with each other because of different types of reasons, but still, and it's quite vital for an understanding of this new Cold War, or something new that's not been identified yet, between the West and Russia, if we can say. And it's interesting that all those treaties that were signed, even recently in 2010, for example, the New START Treaty, and so on, they're good treaties, but somehow it happened that these treaties cannot be used to really battle all those and to tackle all those issues that we are facing now. And nobody wants to impose new and to reach new agreements from both sides. There is no and there is an understanding that somehow it's something that cannot be done. But 20 years ago it could be done. 10 years ago it could be done. And even, not even 10 years, in 2010. It's not so far, but still, all those issues, they could be solved, at least on the paper. But now even the papers are not used to solve problems. Even negotiations by telephone, or when, for example, President Trump calls President Putin and tells him that, there might be a meeting somehow organized, perhaps even in Washington, D.C., it's only a telephone call, but still those levels of critiques that appeared at that very level, and right after this phone call, they somehow symbolize, in my opinion, this whole crisis that we are now facing. That's way more complicated and sophisticated than it was even during the Cold War, because the Cold War, there were phones, and you could call and say, let's discuss this issue and stop the war, for example, in the Middle East between the rivals, and somehow interfere, because otherwise it could lead to some really harsh decisions that might lead to something really harsh between the countries themselves. But now, even though those phones still are in those cabinets and so on, but nobody wants to call. And why is that? I can't say for sure, but maybe we'll try to figure out in our discussion today.
Thank you very much, Ilya. And Richard, what is your opinion on that? Do you think we lost this mechanism, or maybe there's a chance to establish them?
Sure. Well, I'm not as smart as Ilya, so I'm going to focus on the area I know best, which is the security dialogue. And so what I do is I just describe for the listeners and everybody what the U.S. Main documents were and what their content is, and then I talk about the sphere I know about the arms control, which you mentioned, the economics and the diplomacy is very complicated. And I understand there was a Valdai discussion about that recently this week too, which I didn't go to. But so, in terms of the U.S. documents that we're going to go into, they're interesting in that they deviate a lot from the statements that President Trump made during the campaign and to the media and public speeches. So when he was running, it sounded like, it was a bit hard to nail down, and probably deliberately so. But my understanding was his main near-term priority was fighting terrorism, and so he wanted to concentrate on defeating the terrorist threats to the United States and other countries. And then the long-term challenge in his vision was China, less a direct military threat, more an economic threat challenge to the U.S. that we needed to get our act together to deal with. And in that framework, he thought that it was one of the objectives he wanted to achieve was to reconcile relations with Russia, and so to address some of the grievances and try and improve cooperation on the first level terrorism that could be in Syria, Afghanistan, Central Asia, and so on. And then longer term, he wanted to improve relations with Russia to basically, he was concerned that U.S. policies had been driving Russia and China together, and he criticized the Obama administration for that, and he said, we should try and pull Russia away from China, or at least not push them together. And I think there also was a desire to reduce Russian-Iranian ties. So again, not to drive Russia and Iran together, to think of a way to pull Russia back into the Western community, where he thought Russia really belonged. And then he got into office, and he continued to make those statements, and he still does a little less frequently. But he always says, and he wants to improve his relations with Russia. His priorities are really terrorism and China and sometimes other issues. But the documents were very different. The documents were very much a product of the think tank world. Those kind of documents, as you know, right before the elections, there are a whole bunch of these studies came out, What's Your U.S. Foreign Policy? There were about 8 of them on Russia-U.S. relations, and they laid out, and so the documents really reflected that. So you can break the challenges the U.S. has defined into 3 sort of military security type challenges, and then there are a bunch of economic and value challenges. But the first one was Russia and China were seen as great power rivals. In the view of this national security strategy, and just to remind your viewers, the national security strategy's first document came out in December. Then there's the National Defense Strategy, which came out in January. The Nuclear Posture Review came out in February. And Missile Review is supposed to come out last month. I'll tell you where I think it is, but it's the one left to come out of the core security document. So in this national security strategy, the framework is we're back in the priority is great power rivalry, not terrorism. The Russia and China are the main rivals, and it's something of a military challenge, but it's also a value challenge. It's an economic challenge. Basically, it's a multi-dimensional challenge to the U.S.-led world order, which is a phrase that Trump never used that phrase, but the think tank world does a lot. And then they went back to the rogue state framework that had been in the I guess about 2001, 2002, in the early Bush, the George W. Bush administration, the first term, they talked a lot about the rogue states, and at the time it was, I think, Iraq, North Korea, and Iran. This time it's just North Korea and Iran, and they're seen as a threat primarily because they're obtaining weapons of mass destruction or could obtain them, and supporting transnational challenges to U.S. allies, South Korea and Israel and Saudi Arabia and so on. And then the last category was terrorism, but it was sort of grouped in with immigration, with the need to revitalize the U.S. economy. So it's very different because it didn't really reflect Trump's priorities. And the president even made a speech in which he rolled out the document at the Reagan Center. But his speech also wasn't quite in harmony. So we were kind of wondering to what extent this was his strategy as opposed to something that was he was president and he adopted it, wasn't going to be reflected in policies. And that was the same thing with national military strategy. We don't know national military. We don't know a lot about that. There was just a small public section. I assume the classified section talks a lot about what the military needs to do in specific areas. But it was that same kind of framework. The main focus is great power challenges, and that's Russia and China. And the U.S. military needs to reconstitute itself, get more resources, improve it, and it should be able to address these challenges. And then the nuclear posture review, the most recent one, was interesting because of its length and because of the detail it went into the concerns and what the programs were. It was very enlightening. I thought it was the best written of the three, actually, because it was very clear and detailed. It had a real Russia focus, on even more so than China. The real concern is that Russian leaders think that they can. There could be scenarios where they could basically use a nuclear weapon and think NATO would back down, and so we need to dissuade Russia that they could do that. As you know, the Russian government document doesn't really say that, and the Russian has been challenging that, but that sort of was the canonical posture. And then the ballistic missile defense review, we're all kind of wondering to see where Russia and China fits in on that. In the past, the document would always say these U.S. missile defenses are designed to deal with North Korea and Iran. And they're not capable or intended to interfere with Russian and Chinese missiles. This time, I think they're struggling. They're still going to say, which is accurate, that the system is not capable of defeating the Russian and Chinese strategic nuclear deterrents. But it may talk about the need to deal with other kinds of Russian and Chinese missiles. So, Caliber missile launched from sea, or missiles that could be used against Poland, the U.S. missile defense sites in Poland, or the Chinese missiles that could be used against Taiwan or Japan. So it may say that the missile defense goal should be to deal with those too. But I'm not sure. I think they're still debating that language. And now, in terms of negotiation, at least in the area I know well, I don't think much hope for arms control, frankly. I mean, New START just took effect or last month, and the U.S. government says Russia's complying. The Russian government says the U.S. is sort of complying, but there's some concerns about the way the U.S. is classifying the systems. And President Putin has proposed that we extend the treaty by 5 years, which both presidents can do automatically. They don't need legislative approval. And that would, right now, that treaty will expire in 2021, and a 5-year extension would, basically just keep all the terms. And President Trump reportedly objected that it was not, unfair and so on. But the nuclear posture review is open on this one. It doesn't. It just says they have this option. It didn't tell you either way. And there have been hints in some of in the president's remarks that that's what he wanted to talk with Putin about. He mentioned arms control and so on. So I imagine this might come up if they do meet. But beyond that, I think it's hopeless, and because the INF dispute is something that I don't know how to solve that one, because both sides accuse the other of cheating, and the basic Russian government saying, well, you say we're cheating, prove it, and the U.S. says, well, you're cheating, and so I don't, and it might be better just to think about, if that treaty were to go, how do we at least salvage the strategic controls? The INF treaty was important symbolically, but I'm not sure how important it is now, given that both Russia and the U.S. have missiles that can be launched from sea and air of this range, and Russia showed that in Syria. Just prohibiting the ground launch missiles, and only Russia and the U.S., when like China, Iran, Pakistan, all these things. I'm not sure that if it went away, it would make much of a difference. I'm more concerned about if the New START's not renewed, what happens. I don't think there'll be a full-scale arms race. I think economic considerations and need to use systems for elsewhere might take priority. But I don't see if you're right, if President Trump says, well, maybe maybe I should meet with Putin or talk with Putin, and he's criticized for that and backs off, then how it would really take the two presidents to decide the new start, renewal, or further diplomacy. And so if we don't have that, I don't know to go beyond that. The dialogue, I mean, I'm glad REACT's doing this, and it's helpful to engage with you, and I've been trying to meet with a bunch of Russians here, and we do have Russian guests in the U.S., but it appears to be worse than any time I've seen. A lot of the exchange programs are collapsing, and I'm struggling to think how we could get around this challenge, that it's sort of radioactive to negotiate in some way. But maybe your viewers and you guys have some ideas on that one.
We'll touch on the viewers' opinions a bit later as well. Maybe, Ilya, do you have something which you would like to add, or shall we just continue to the questions?
Well, the only thing I could add is regarding the START treaty, why Trump really criticizes also the START treaty, because it was signed during the Obama administration. So this is the simplest explanation I can get, because Trump criticizes almost all of the stuff that was organized or signed during the Obama administration. And I would say that also regarding Iran and the nuclear program in Iran and the Iran nuclear deal, how he really was opposed and is still opposing this nuclear deal. It really needs to know where its path to giving of some countries that are not really obtaining yet all those weaponry, to see that, well, if even the United States is now opposing the deal, then what else do we have to do as to just to somehow get those weaponries, and as fast as we get it, then we will have this opportunity to somehow fulfill our destiny, like the North Korea, like saying, well, yes, we have weapons that can reach, well, not the United States, but Japan, and destroy Japan or something like, and all those threats that are now heard from North Korea. This is a sign of a diplomacy crisis, not between Korea and other countries, but between the countries that somehow can control those weapons, and really needed to control how those weapons are going back and forth, maybe to pressure some other key players in the regions, like China. Maybe if Russia, United States combine, could pressure some regional players to somehow pressure again those who are minor players. Maybe this level, using those different levels of diplomacy and influence, can somehow solve those crises. But because of the lack of communications between these two countries, trying to somehow impose new deals or sanctions on minor players is useless, I guess, because somehow if you can talk with your opponent, why do those who are not listening to you somehow will do something that you really want them to do? So it's a very complicated thing, and I would say that somehow perhaps there might be some interesting moves made by the presidents, because, and especially by Trump, because if Trump is really such a person that's eager to that is really eager to proving others that he is tough, and he is a president, so not any other person in the United States. So he is the one to decide which way the country is going to go, and to which crisis is the United States going to solve first, and perhaps he can show this force. Maybe during the talks between Putin and Trump, but again, it's really complicated due to many political divisions inside the United States themselves. So I can't really say that Trump was really willing to somehow communicate more with Russia on regarding the issue of arms race, because he, in my opinion, he was always ready to say that the United States has the best arms selling companies and the best nuclear weapons, all the best of the best. So why even talk about arms control with other countries, because, well, if we talk about arms control, it means that we somehow are ready to give away our own arms, and Trump is not ready for that, and was not ready for that, in my opinion. But regarding Russia, well, perhaps Trump is not alone in this case, so maybe there are other people, and maybe those who will also get into his administration, because we've seen so many transformations in the during the past year in his administration. Perhaps new people will also come, and sometimes you don't really know. There might be a person who will say finally, that at least one person who will say, well, let's even talk, and let's finally talk about something with Russians. Otherwise, well, we'll just go back and forth, and when Trump leaves the White House, maybe from this term, or maybe after 2 terms, who knows, but still, after he leaves, what will happen then? Because if the conditions now are such, if he has such bad conditions now, and cannot formulate the basic rules of how to communicate, how to play these games, what are we going to expect in like 5 or 6 years? So this is my opinion on that.
Thank you. I forgot to mention the importance of Iran, Korea. I think if we can prevent Iran and Korea from getting nuclear weapons, North Korea, then I don't see another country eager to get them.
Yeah.
But if we fail there, then we don't know. That releases the cork in the bottle. I mean, lots of countries might want them. But
not even countries, maybe some other players like terrorist group.
Yeah, and the challenge we're having, that's incredibly important. That's an obvious area where Russia and the U.S. should cooperate, because I mean, we don't want nuclear terrorism. We already seen chemical terrorism in the Middle East, and we certainly don't want to see nuclear terrorism. The challenge is, I mean, you're right. It's a different world, so it's not really possible for Washington and Moscow to tell Iran or tell North Korea, or say, okay, you will give up your nuclear material, you stop testing, because they just say no. I mean, I remember that, you're too young, but I remember when there were Middle East wars, when in my youth, Kissinger would go to meet with Dobrynin in Moscow, and they'd sign a ceasefire, and then Kissinger would go to Tel Aviv, and Dobrynin would go to Cairo, and they'd force them to ceasefire. But now we just can't do that anymore, and so it's just much more harder to control these policies, which could really well lead to great global instability. So it's more that the talking it's just also our influence is less than it was in the past.
Yeah.
I disagree with you. I think on the arms control, I think that President Trump, for the past 30 years, he's made somewhat contradictory statements. So he's been complaining about the arms control, arms races. He wanted to be a New START negotiator. He actually said he could negotiate a great deal.
Yeah,
he's made he's made statements about how terrible it is that nuclear weapons are spreading, but he also wants to have U.S. nuclear superiority, and supposedly told President Putin, if we're in a race, the U.S. will win. So it's sort of a bit contradictory. I wouldn't though exclude that if he was presented with an arms deal, or arms control agreement that he thought acceptable, that he would agree to. And it may even be more in line with traditional Russian thinking, because as you know, in the past, the U.S. is saying we should just keep on cutting the U.S. and Russian forces along the New START model, whereas the Russian government has been saying for about a decade now that this process has exhausted itself, and we need to transform the arms control process to include a wider range of countries and a wider range of systems, strategic, defensive of all, but also hypersonic, whatever. And Trump might be open to something like that, because it would be different from what Obama and previous president. It'd be a different path, but at the moment it's not possible. So maybe as we get closer to the New START end date, we'll see a greater effort to.
But we can see a new president by that time in the United States. So it's 2021.
Yeah. So it'd be close, but you still. I mean, that might even be in the last. If there, let's just say President Trump wasn't reelected, and this is last year in the first term, it might be a legacy he wants to leave. He would negotiate a treaty,
Perhaps, yeah.
and then get it approved, because it would be politically difficult for the next administration to do. So he could do that and then leave that as his legacy, an arms control agreement between Russia and the U.S.
Yeah, not just the border wall.
Right.
Okay, thank you very much both. We have several questions from our readers. So the first one is about the latest developments. It's can growing tensions in the relations between Russia and the West because of Skripal case influence the situation and lead to new strengthened measures on defense capacity building? Anyone wants to start?
It's not helpful. I mean, because if we, as we mentioned, we need to cooperate against WD terrorism, and then we're accusing each other's governments of engaging in WD terrorism. It's very corrosive dialogue. So far, it hasn't affected the nuclear terrorism discussion. It's all been much focused on the chemical. But this is, I mean, in one way, it helps remind us of the importance. I mean, if a little a small amount of chemical agent can do, something like this. Just think what could happen if there was a large amount of material available to terrorists. Right now, they use basically chlorine or simple chemical weapons, sometimes sarin, supposedly. But these weapons are much more stronger. And then if it was a nuclear material, I mean, just imagine if there had been an active nuclear terrorism in Salvador. Nobody would want to go near that city. I mean, even so it just reminds us of importance, but it does make it difficult. I mean, I think we all saw the Security Council dialogue, and so it's just one more challenge to renew the cooperation.
Yeah, that's a challenge for sure. But this is again a proof to the basic idea that even the Skripal case, it didn't happen in the United States or in Russia. It happened in London. And again, if the two countries, like the United States and Russia, cannot talk to each other on this issue regarding another country that somehow is in between the rivalry between these countries, then what can we expect from London? Because London is of course viewing itself as an ally with the United States, and so it's quite vital for the diplomacy to work finally, because sometimes all those arguments regarding even the chemical weapons, like the recent news about the rain, for example, people were smelling the rain. How can you smell the rain? I mean, I can smell a bit of the rain in Syria. Well, if you can smell a bit of the rain in Syria, then maybe you're already dying, or but you are not dead yet. So we live in a time when accusations, because during the Cold War, when countries accused each other, they were most of the time there were proofs to those accusations regarding maybe airplanes that were shut down, or bodies that were shown, and you can identify the people itself, and people were still calling each other, meeting, and the diplomats were talking about these issues. But nowadays, even the diplomats cannot talk, they cannot meet, because when they meet, it means that they communicate, and if they communicate, it leads to another basic idea. Well, somehow there might be a meddling into the government structure, or by Russian or by Americans. So it's vital to understand that we need some basic rules now to organize these new meetings and to even talk with each other, because those rules, even the Security Council, like you mentioned, if we look at it and how it all was organized, and all those even proofs that were shown by the Russian side, the other side was just saying nothing. Like you were trying to say to tell your opponent your personal arguments and your points, and you expect your opponent to agree or not to, or to disagree. But what we've seen was that all those arguments and all those points were just left, not touched, and sometimes this is not the case you want to see. It's like with talking with a person about your personal life and trying to communicate and complain about something, and if you complain or trying to say, "But have you seen this and that?" and another person will just say nothing to that and just try to turn all this discussion to another topic. Well, if we use this case, it will lead to nowhere. I would say, and maybe it's also a crisis of legal issues, of legal proofs, or maybe new treaties that could be signed regarding those, for example, legal claims about things that do occur, like the weaponry, like the like all those accusations that, for example, were made against the United States by Russia during the 90s or early 2000s regarding all those missile deployments in Europe, and trying to say, and Russia was just trying to say that, okay, just give us legal proof that all those missiles are not, and all those capacities that you have are not against Russia. Maybe if you were mentioning some kind of new treaty that could be signed or introduced by Trump, maybe if just this one point would be added to this treaty and nothing else, maybe this will at least start a new path and give us this opportunity to understand that if something is signed and said that this is not used against you, but it's used to somehow, I don't know, prove that we have other opponents or other threats that we could together somehow battle and so on and so forth, at least signed by a paper. Maybe it will be a good sign for future presidents, for future people and communications to start. Otherwise, we'll have again these accusations with no proofs from both sides, and this crisis of diplomacy will really destroy all those remains of goodwill that was left after the Cold War ended, actually, I would say.
Okay, thank you. So, the second question is from another reader. She's asking, according to the research, the US military expenditure is $611 billion, Chinese 215 billion, Russia only 70 billion. Moreover, in 2018 National Defense Strategy of the US, among the threats, China is always mentioned first as a primary competitor, whereas Russia is always on the second place. What might be the reason? Doesn't that mean that the United States see China as a more powerful and important international player than Russia? I guess we should start with Richard because it's
Right,
more
sure.
about the US.
Yeah, it's there's a bit of a debate in the U.S. Security community and in the government about, is Russia the greater threat or is China the greater threat? And Russia, I think, has clearly in the nuclear realm, the capabilities are superior. But we don't quite know about the Chinese because they don't tell us. China is not a member of any arms control agreement, so there are no limits on the number they can have, unlike the Russian US. They're underground, they're concealed. We don't quite know. They're making some progress. They're still thought to be only have hundreds of warheads, whereas the US and Russia have thousands. But they are spending so much money, as your viewer points out, that they can. They're clearly building up their conventional forces. I mean, they're buying good stuff from Russia. The Su-35 is a great plane. S-400 is a very good air defense system, and so they're buying those, and they're making their own equivalents. What we don't quite know is how good those are in practice. I mean, the Russian systems, we understand that because they've been used in Syria, and the U.S. systems, they've been used in all over the place. China, we don't know. They've never gone to war recently, so we don't quite know. On paper, they've got all these great systems, like their F-5 planes, but we don't quite know how well they'll work. But the trends are clearly, if China keeps on spending 3 times more than Russia, then at some point you would think that they would continue to rise, perhaps surpass Russia in saying capabilities. Yeah, and the U.S. spends a lot, and I think that number is going to increase with the new budget. Some of it's because personnel costs are higher. I mean, you basically have to spend a lot more money, I think, per soldier in the U.S. than you do in Russia or China. I think it's gotten better in Russia. I remember, though, it used to be really bad if you were a conscript, for example, though the conditions in life were bad. but still, I still think that the U.S. spends a lot more because they have to recruit, they have to compete with private companies to hire people. And the U.S. forces are operating all over the world, whereas the Chinese forces can concentrate in Asia, East Asia, and so on. The ranking of the threats, I mean, Trump clearly sees China as a greater threat than Russia. Some of the strategy documents, national security strategy, was a little focused on Russia. The nuclear posture is definitely focused on Russia, but that's far makes sense given the imbalance. I'm personally more worried about a China-U.S. clash. I think that there's just so many unknowns. I think could easily see China doing something that the Chinese meant as a defensive measure and the U.S. takes as an offensive measure. I mean, I think with the U.S. Russia, we understand what our forces do. We've had a lot of engagement. Whereas the China, I think, might be a bit of a mystery, and particularly since they like to conceal things. They cherish opacity. So I'm a bit more worried. But the question I'd love to throw to you guys is, why isn't Russia more afraid of China, given the trends we've mentioned?
Well, maybe because of political issues. So, in case, well, you were right about also, I will add and comment on the private sector, private companies that are used in the Middle East, for example, and were used for the past 15 years. Maybe one of the points that could be added into future treaty or some sort would be the total prohibition of those private sector used. Because if armies are not fighting with each other, but some private sector is fighting with each other and trying to formulate new agenda and trying to seek for something that's not somehow written in the governmental sector and in governmental doctrine or new security treaties or something. Those private companies that are sometimes private or sometimes connected directly to the government, it's a sign of trying to postpone a solution to a problem to some other time. And all those postponing, it leads to, again, to not just trying to solve the issue now. If you postpone, it doesn't mean that the issue is going to, and this very challenge will not disappear. It will still be growing, and maybe it will transform into another challenge and go into, and we have more and more threats going on. And those private companies, they could, if you can buy a private company, why can't you use it in your own terms and add it to a terrorist group? And we have terrorist group using private companies to trying to so it could lead to a sphere that somehow can be used in the movies now, but maybe in the near future we can see it also.
We have a real term example of this. There was that clash in Syria that we're lucky didn't go anywhere. But if these private companies can drag us into war.
Because and even though they are not like the military fighting military, but still all these incidents occurring are very different from the times of the Cold War again, and as we would say, it's really interesting how to tackle those issues. But regarding China, why aren't we afraid of China? Well, I can't say that we're like completely not afraid of China. Well, China is our good neighbor in a way that's trying to communicate on political or economic spheres, and the political sphere is now dominating the world itself, I would say, and mixing military and politics in case that politics is now used with no proofs. I mean, politics was always a sphere that's somehow different from diplomacy itself, because diplomacy is I would say something really close to a military sphere, in a case that it's all very strict, it's all used by rules, and it's organized by some treaties. But politicians used to say things that are somehow deviating from all those issues that are signed by into treaties between the countries. And for example, in the case of Skripal, or in the British case now, we could say that politicians that are not and governmental sector personnel that's not actually, that wasn't trained for the governmental sphere to work in the government. That's diplomats that were not actually career diplomats like in the United States or in Russia, that are diplomats that were trained for many years to become, to take those positions. But now we see that people, not only in Great Britain and other countries, also become politicians and become state diplomats that can't really be identified as diplomats regarding the cases that are in front of them, and mixing up this crisis of identity, diplomacy, and politics with the military sphere. This is what we are now trying to solve and to understand, to somehow say, well, politics is politics, diplomacy is diplomacy, and military sphere is military sphere. Let's somehow talk about all of them separately in case we want to reach some agreements. And this is why maybe we are not so afraid of China in this case, because politically and economically it's completely different. From military point of view, as you've mentioned, there's not so much information regarding the basic use of Chinese weaponry. Maybe, well, the first aircraft carrier that's now going to somehow be used maybe in the South China Sea, or just will be a symbol of a new Chinese super military. This is really so super. We can't really say for sure because we haven't seen it in action, at least in some training sphere. So perhaps we'll just wait and see if China is really such a threat in this very case. But perhaps what we are not talking today about is cybersecurity. Cybersecurity, not regarding politics again and diplomacy, but regarding the case of controlling the cyber sphere. Nobody really knows how to control those, because we've had so many incidents, not only between the United States and Russia, but regarding private sector that's been controlled, that's been very difficult to identify and control and to stop from spreading and from interference. And somehow countries and officials accuse other countries of just trying to help those hackers to hack into some systems, but cannot identify them. So this is one of the spheres that can be somehow regarding all those going back and forth between politicians. Well, you made it, I know you, but from both sides, from the United States and from Russia, we can't say if it's this very case was happened and organized by a hacker from India, maybe from Pakistan, from Afghanistan. We can't identify because it's very difficult, and maybe this is one of the cases. But regarding all those, no matter what the level of our political dialogue is now, we really need to talk about the cybersphere, because otherwise we'll again see terrorist groups, maybe just one person trying to hack, to maybe use his tools to somehow interfere with the traffic lights and make all the traffic into some really bad things to happen. And so this is one of the cases I would really emphasize, if we can say that. Why are we not afraid? We are afraid maybe of this sphere, because this is one of the modern spheres that's nobody is really knowing how to deal with.
Right. I mean, if we should be so lucky if it's just traffic lights.
Yeah, I mean, it's just one of the.
They could, nuclear power plants, or nuclear command and control system. Yeah. I mean, they could do if they really were.
If really willing to do it, yeah. And you cannot stop them. That's the point.
Well, maybe we don't know.
We don't know, because
we're becoming better, but so the attackers also becoming better. So we just don't know. I mean, we just don't know. I know that there's been some concern, particularly for the China, U.S., Russia systems. If they were to be degraded, maybe we'd mistaken an attack for when it was actually simulating the computer and so on. So it's very alarming.
Mm-hmm. Is it part of the reason why part of the US missile system are still run on the floppy disks?
I don't know if it's deliberately, but it is helpful that nobody's able to hack something like that.
To hack them.
Yeah, but they're actually, there's a lot of money in the defense budget to modernize this, but who knows? You have example of those people in Russia who you use their supercomputer to mine Bitcoin. You have, somehow both the Korea and the Iranian systems were supposedly cut off from the internet, but apparently not. And I'm sure there are vulnerabilities in the U.S. system that we just don't know about.
You can hack the stock market and go completely ruin the economy of the country in just 1 hour or something. So.
That's true. Actually, the next question is about terrorism, so it partly builds up on what you said. So regarding the fight against international terrorism, on the one hand, one can see that cooperation between the US and Russia in this area is a binding factor. On the other hand, this fight against terrorism sometimes turns into the fight for spheres of interest, like in Syria, for example. Do you believe that cooperation of this kind can still play a positive role in Russian-American relations and not lead to more conflicts?
Well, I would hope that it will lead to a normalization in our relations, because as we've talked about it, otherwise, we'll have some other players appearing that are not listening to our countries and to the governments and to state officials, to just not listening to anyone saying that, well, you can talk or you cannot talk, but it doesn't really matter for us because we are going to earn money from that and from that, and use tools that are not controlled by you, and were not even made by you, but maybe they were made by some Taiwan guys, like in a basement, who obtain those tools from other cargo ships or something. So modernize this weaponry. That's not nuclear. That's not I don't know, hypersonic weaponry or something like that. Not this kind of weaponry that we would think might be used, in the terms of the Cold War in other countries and other regions, like not against Britain, but to somehow deter, but somehow to influence politically, saying that, well, we have tougher nuclear weapons. Okay, you have tougher nuclear weapons, but the terrorist group, they don't really need to obtain a nuclear missile. They can hack to some other, as we've mentioned, places and crash the things that you don't really control. In this very case, they don't really need to be that close to a missile or to other place to somehow kill all the people who control it and use it and steal it. They can just hack it from the basement in some other country, from third world country, and nobody will stop them. So this is a case that really is vital and must be put on the table of negotiations between the countries, and as soon as possible, because otherwise in the 5-10 years, who knows, in 15 years, we will see other countries emerging on this, selling this type of weaponry to others, and they will say, well, we're not going to sign any treaties, because what's the use of treaties if nobody is trying to follow those treaties? Nobody is really going to sign new treaties. So we are not going to participate in your political games, the United States and Russia. You play your games, we'll play our own games. So, and this is a really vital thing, I guess, for the current situation, even in our relations in this field.
Thank you.
Yeah, terrorism. I know that President Putin, a few years ago, and then for several years beyond that, really stressed Russia's desire to cooperate with terrorism, lead an anti-terrorist coalition, and it didn't get much support in the West until President Trump came in, but it hasn't occurred even after Trump's election for some reasons we know about, and some others we maybe know. The problem, I guess, we've been having is defining who's a terrorist. I think we see this in Syria. People are opposing Assad. Some of them the U.S. considers and Russia both consider terrorists. Others they differ. And then there is some example of cooperation. They mentioned recently, again, one of the senior Russian officials a couple days ago at a conference I was at reminded us all about St. Petersburg, because people were worried that there's just no dialogue. We said, no, that's not true. We do. The U.S. CIA, for example, warned us about St. Petersburg attack, and Russia tries to help the U.S. in this regard. But I think we all agree it's suboptimal. But it's hard to cooperate on that and then keep that separate from our disagreements over, Syria or whatever. But I think your questioner and then your own comments are correct that in principle that should be an area to cooperate, particularly the more serious types of terrorism, nuclear, chemical, biological. But I mean, as another one of your viewers pointed out earlier, the Skripal case is going to make this tough for a while, so we have to think about how to overcome barriers there.
So the last question which we have is actually it's addressed to you, Dr. White. It says, "Hi, I'm one of your former interns."
There are many, so greetings. I used to have Russian interns. They cut back on the exchange program, but there's still some, I think, floating around here.
I guess this one is not from Russia, judging on the time when he uploaded the comment. It's late at night or very early in the morning. Okay. And he used a nickname, so
well, if they're students, they don't sleep anyway.
It's always entertaining to discuss with you on political and military issues. If you get a chance to serve as a high-ranking official in the presidential administration in the future, what will be your visions for the world order, and how will you shape foreign policies towards Russia and China? Will you cherish the values of Henry Kissinger? Will you propose policies that will change the world for decades to come? And have you ever thought of becoming a U.S. president?
That's a weird question. I can't imagine who that is. Definitely somebody who wants to have a little fun at my expense. One, it's not going to happen. Neither president or senior official. But two, all right, more realistic, what would be the ideal vision I'd have for the world? And then I'd like you to share your insights. My own view is that the Russia-U.S. relationship's a lot worse than it really should be, objectively speaking. And the problem is that means we're foregoing opportunities for mutually beneficial cooperation on climate change, on economic development of the Arctic, and then some security instruments we mentioned, countering terrorism, arms control, particularly weapons of mass destruction terrorism. I think definitely would want to work on trying to improve that. The China-U.S. relationship's much more interesting because it's more open in the sense that I know less about China. I don't know Chinese. I have a big mistake, so I hope whoever this intern is doing that. But that one, it could go very antagonistic, and I worry about that, as I mentioned before, because I think that I could more easily see a military clash breaking out in China and the U.S. than I can between Russia and the U.S. But it could also go quite well, depending on developments, and so that one's more open. So I guess for the U.S.-Russia relationship, I try and build on small steps where we can cooperate now, and then as those show fruition, we can expand that. The China-U.S. one, I'd be willing to take more bold gambles on to see the impact. That said, what's been happening now is it's becoming more. I think the China-U.S. relationship is going to get more tense because of some of the U.S. trade policies, and then some of the developments within China. It used to be much easier for us to travel to China. I mean, it's never been a problem to come to Russia. I've never had any visa problems with the Russian government. They've always been good to think tank people. But the Chinese government's become really hostile to the think tank community in Washington. They see us as undesirable, I guess. I don't know what the word is. So it's much harder to get a visa now, and the dialogue within China is getting much harder. So I now worry, for example, when I have Chinese students about what work they do, the interns. I don't want to give them to have any work on Taiwan or Xinjiang or any sensitive topics. I worry what can happen to them there. So and then as I mentioned, this trade conflict is going to make everything messy. I imagine Russia would benefit because one of the problems I think Russia's had is that in terms of competing for Japanese investment or someone, even though the Japanese are probably more favorably disposed to Russia than they are to China, there's high risk investing in the Russian market because of sanctions, because of other things. whereas China was considered safer, and the Chinese even would tend to invest in the U.S. Rather than Russia, because it was. But now, maybe not so much.
Now politics influence trade sphere much more than it used to be. So maybe this is the reason.
What would your vision for the world?
My bigger vision is going to.
You're younger. You have more chance to be president of Russia.
Oh, well, it's very hard to tell for now. But still, I would say that we need to go back to the roots, meaning that the world is such a huge place, and the spheres of interest that our countries had for the past that's been changed for the past 50, 100 years. We need to go back to those roots, meaning that countries cannot fight with each other on the political sphere or in dividing the world into different regions, the whole world. So it's hard to imagine Russia and the United States trying to fight for Zimbabwe, for the government, like it was in the Cold War time, because, well, the United States it's not that much interest in those countries anymore as it was during the Cold War, because there is no need to fight for the for the heads, for the people's ideology and how they view the United States or the Soviet Union at that time. Like, are they so eager to be communists and to organize revolutions and prohibit companies, the Western companies, from going to their markets and all those things. So I guess that the basic idea is to sit, talk, understand that sometimes it's not so good to enter the sphere of interest of a country that's been the sphere of interest for this country for the past 100 or 200 years. Like, it will be no good for Russia trying to interfere in Central America as much as, for example, the United States wants to interfere in Eastern Europe or even in Central Asia, or again the Central Asia, well, the fight between the countries like United States, Russia, or China for the Central Asian region. It leads to the lack of communications on the Afghanistan matter, for example, because people fighting for the political divisions in these countries, how to obtain new ways of building, for example, economic routes, and so forget that, well, we have a country that's been at war for the past 15 years, and before that it was also a country that made those and helped to appeal for those terrorist groups that are now spreading all over the world. And sometimes these basic ideas that are slipping away from the leaders that are too eager to fight for the sphere of interest of opponent, rather than thinking that, well, we have our own backyard, well, we need to be ones that are somehow trying to control that backyard, that no terrorist group would appear on this backyard and somehow influence other countries that are nearby. So that countries need to somehow divide the sphere of interest and understand that it's vital to communicate somehow, to battle and to solve all those challenges that would inevitably appear on the border issues. But if we try to always interfere into each other's national interest spheres, well, it will lead to nowhere. And that's what we have now, because countries try to somehow influence those spheres that much that they forget about what happens at their very backyard, and somehow this is where all the stuff really occurs. And somehow when you forget about it, well, in some time it will lead to the basic understanding that, well, you cannot even stand still because you have some really bad things going on right near your border that were not organized by your enemy or somebody else, but because you just forgot about your own border, trying to think more about the border of your opponent. So this is my basic understanding of the world, maybe in the future if it's not.
Okay. Thank you very much, colleagues. It was a very interesting discussion, and thanks to all the viewers. If somebody missed the broadcast, it will be available at our YouTube channel and on our website. So thank you very much.
Comment and subscribe.
Yes.